Hey budding herbalists, I'm Maria Noel Groves, herbalist at Wintergreen Botanicals and author of Body into Balance and Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies. Today we're going to make a really fun recipe, and that is herbal cordials. They're a great recipe to share with others or just have for fun. They do provide a little bit of medicinal properties depending upon what ingredients you've added to them, but the fact that they're in a base of sugar and alcohol makes them maybe not the healthiest recipe that we use in herbal remedies, but it is certainly a fun one to bring out at special herbal gatherings. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to make them with fresh ingredients. Dry ingredients, there's really not too much of a difference except for the amount of plant material that you might be using. And then we'll also make a alcohol-free variation, which would be a Oxymel, which is a vinegar honey base. So let's get started. When we're working with cordials, oftentimes we're going to be using a sweetening agent, and while you could certainly just make an infused vodka or infused brandy or some other infused spirit and not have any sugar at all, typically to be a cordial there's some kind of sweetener being added, and usually it's plain old sugar. And regular white junky sugar, I usually prefer to source sugar that's been made from sugar cane versus from sugar beets, so that I know that it's not been genetically modified. But your regular plain old junky sugar is going to have a much better shelf life than something made with even organic or less refined sugar or honey or some of our other natural sweeteners. Also, your white sugar is going to have basically a clear color and a very neutral flavor, and so if you really want the flavor and the color of your herbs to shine in a recipe, then white sugar is best. However, you can definitely do this whole recipe with organic sugar or with another natural sweetener instead. You'll just get a more of a deeper caramel color from those other sweeteners, and you'll also get whatever flavor is imparted by them, and that might be really favorable. I once made a really lovely linden cordial, and I did 2 mini batches, one with sugar and one with honey, and I really liked the way the honey set off the flavors of the linden much better than the one with plain old sugar. So you can play around. Always do little batches first. Make sure that you like the taste of it, you like how it came out, before you go ahead and make a really huge batch. Personally, I don't actually use cordials a whole lot. Most of the time that I'm making a cordial, it's for class, and so I like making really small batches because I may or may not ever get around to drinking them. I'm just not really into that sweet of an alcohol kind of flavor in my daily routine. But these can be really fun to play around with making cordials. You can mix them with seltzer water, and in your notes you'll find all sorts of other tips for ways to use your cordials if you are so inclined. If worse comes to worse, you could play around with using them as marinades and other things. So let's start off by making our simple syrup. And I like to do a basic recipe, which is 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. And you'll find different simple syrup recipes out there, and that's just the one that I use. It also allows me to use a little bit more alcohol. So I'm going to do 2 parts, and then I've got 1 part water. And your final volume is going to be whatever your parts of sugar were, in my experience at least. So I'm going to stir that in. So right now you can see that the sugar is not totally dissolved. It's still in there. It's still kind of grainy and gritty. It has a little bit more of a whitish look to it right now. And I'm just going to keep stirring and gently warm that until the sugar is no longer grainy and gritty and it's dissolved. So you can see that you can still see that grit, and so it's not melted down yet. You can see that it's no longer gritty. I'm just going to pour that right into a container. So now I have my simple syrup ready to go, and we can use it to make our cordial. For today's cordial with fresh herbs, I'm going to use lemongrass because I don't know if you can tell, but it's winter and snowing out here, so I don't have a whole lot of fresh herbs to choose from. And maybe I had a pot of lemongrass, but actually I don't. I usually repurpose those each year and send it back to the ground. But I harvest all of my lemongrass at the end of the season, and I save the stalks. I'll dry the tops for tea, and then I save the stalks in the freezer fresh, and I can use those in other recipes. So this is a great recipe for me to use all these like little ones. You know, I have some really teeny tiny, you know, narrow lemongrass bases, and so that's what I'm going to use to make today's recipe. So I'm just going to chop these up and add them to the jar. Lemongrass is pretty strong, so I'm just going to fill this jar a part way, but if I had some, you know, fresher, juicier herbs, I might fill them up, you know, half to a quarter or so of the way. I could also add some chopped fruit if I wanted to, but for today I'm just going to keep it really basic with the lemongrass. And then I'm just going to eyeball, but I'm going to do about 1/3 simple syrup, and then 2/3 are good quality vodka. Any kind of decent drinking vodka will do. The better quality, the nicer your cordial will taste, but you can also work within the parameters of your budget. So whatever's convenient for you. And so I'm just going to kind of eyeball about 1/3 or so simple syrup. You could certainly adjust that according to your preferences. It's fine to make it less sweet, but you want to have at least 25 to 30% pure alcohol by volume in your finished extract. And so, you know, when you're working with vodka, usually it's 80 proof. So if you did 50-50 of sugar and this, 80 proof means that it's got 40% alcohol. Whenever you have the proof, if you cut it in half, that's the percent pure alcohol by volume. And we don't really want to go below 25-30%, or else our cordial will no longer be shelf stable. And so if you did 50-50, you would end up with 20% alcohol by volume in your final extract, and that's a little bit of a questionable range. So I like to bump it up a little bit more, and that's why I personally do 2/3 of vodka or brandy, and then 1/3 of your sweetener of choice. And so I'm going to just eyeball that the rest of the way. If you had fresh herbs that were really, you know, really fluffy, you might decide to fill it all the way to the very tippity top, and that way you can be assured that as little as possible is having a chance to get exposed to oxygen at the top, and it's not fluffing up above the alcohol. That's especially important when you're working with fresh herbs, and especially important when you're working, especially important when you're working with fresh fruits, because they go funky really quickly. And usually those extracts, you're going to want to strain them out within just a couple of days, because they start to lose their fresh flavor over time. And you're also going to want to be really cognizant to be shaking those up regularly so that you have a chance to rotate, so you don't have anything getting funky at the top of the jar. So I'm just going to cover this up with a lid. It doesn't really matter in this case if it's plastic or metal, just something that seals tight. I'm just going to shake that up. And I'm going to give it a good shake every now and then. So, you know, if I come across it while I'm out in the kitchen, I'm just going to give it another good shake or two and kind of keep moving it from there. I could have added 2 or 3 times more lemongrass to this, and it would have just come out even better, even more flavorful. With cordials, I like to taste them every few days, every day, every 2 days, and then, you know, if it's been longer, you can wait longer in between tastings. But I'll just take off the lid, you know, swish the spoon around and then taste the spoon. And if it tastes good to you, go ahead and strain it out, because you might not like the way the flavor develops if you let it steep for longer. And you might actually have a really lovely extract within just 1 or 2 days of making your cordial. Or you might like how it gets when it gets stronger after it's had a chance to steep for much longer. If you were using dried herb instead of fresh, usually the percentage is a little bit less, because dried herb's more dense and, you know, is going to impart a stronger flavor generally speaking. And so you could fill it up maybe about a quarter to half the way with your dried herbs, and then add your liquid into it. And we're going to make an Oxymel with dried plant. The percentages are pretty similar with that. Whereas with fresh plant material, you can use quite a bit and, you know, make a really lovely extract. Sometimes the dried herbs actually make a even better tasting cordial, because the fresh herbs get a little bit oxidized and lose some of their fresh flavor. Whereas once they've been dried properly, the they're not as likely to do that over time. So play around with small batches, see what you like. Next up, let's make an Oxymel so that we can make something somewhat similar without any alcohol at all. So making an Oxymel is very similar to making a cordial, except instead of using simple syrup and alcohol, I'm going to be using honey and vinegar. So oxy is the vinegar and mel is the honey. And it makes a kind of similar, pleasant to drink remedy. You know, usually you're not going to drink a whole ounce at a time with an Oxymel, but you might take a spoonful or two and add it to seltzer water, or you can have it by the spoonful directly, or you can use it to make salad dressings, marinades, all sorts of other great things. But the process is pretty similar. You have a little bit more flexibility with the vinegar to honey ratio than you do with the alcohol to sugar, because of the shelf stability of vinegar and honey are both not as good as alcohol, but better than simple syrup. And so, you know, you have a lot of flexibility with this, and it will keep on the shelf generally for quite a while, at least a year, sometimes longer. And especially if you use dried herbs. I personally prefer to use dried herbs when making Oxymels because they have a very low risk of getting funky, whereas using some fresh plant material, because of the moisture associated with it, they can go bad. You can still make an Oxymel and it still comes out nicely, but it might not have as good of a shelf life, and you'll have to use your senses. And unfortunately, by the time your senses perceive something going bad, they already started to go bad quite a while before that. So that's one of the reasons why I prefer to use dry herb for this. And the percentages are kind of similar as far as your plant material to your solvents as you would have them if you were going to be making a cordial. So let's go ahead and get started. So for this particular recipe, I'm going to use a combination of dandelion and ginger. It makes a really lovely Oxymel that is digestive, and the sweet and sour flavors really do complement it quite nicely. If you're a fan of ginger, honey, lemon tea, you will notice that there's somewhat similar profiles to this particular recipe, or perhaps fire cider, somewhat similar profiles. Fire cider is actually an Oxymel, and it's made with spicy ingredients in a vinegar honey base. And so this comes out really lovely, and you can use it to support digestion. Vinegar on its own supports digestion, but now we've added a bitter digestive in the form of dandelion root and that warming, spicy ginger root in it as well. And it's just a really lovely, it's one of my favorite Oxymels to make alongside elderberry Oxymel. So I'm going to add about equal parts. You can adjust, you know, maybe you want it to be more bitter, so you'll add more dandelion root. Maybe you'll want it to be more gingery, so you'll add more ginger, and you can just play around with what you like. I'm going to add a couple spoonfuls of dry ginger chips, and of course you could use fresh grated ginger root too. And while it is a fresh ingredient, it usually keeps pretty well in an Oxymel base. Next up, I have some raw dandelion root, and that's going to be my bitter digestive agent, and it'll balance quite nicely with the ginger. My jar is about half full of herbs now. I could go more, but one of the things that I run the risk of is, especially with these small batches, that so much of it absorbs the liquid and then I don't end up with any extract. So I'm just going to do it about halfway or so. Maybe it's a smidge more than halfway, and now I'm going to cover it with my solvents. I like to add the vinegar first because it's harder to get the honey to mix in with the herbs. So if I add the vinegar first, that's going to cover up the herbs. I'll add the honey to the top, and then I go ahead and mix everything in. I'm going to just eyeball, and it's mostly going to be vinegar, a little more than half, and then I'll leave some space at the top for the honey. Because I didn't pre-mix this, I don't know exactly how much honey I'm going to have to vinegar. When I'm covering herb material, of course, the herb itself is going to take up some of this space. And so, you know, I just eyeball, but if you wanted to be exact, you could pre-mix your honey and your vinegar separately and then add it. And also, if you warm your honey up in some, you know, just put your container in a little bit of warm water, that'll make it more runny, and it will make it a little bit easier to mix the honey in, especially if you're planning on pre-mixing your solvents ahead of time. I'm just going to fill it the rest of the way with honey. And you can make it as sweet or not sweet as you want. This one is going to end up being on the sweeter side. So if I wanted to make it more vinegary, that would be fine. I would just use a little bit more vinegar. And ideally, we want to fill it to the tippity top. I'd say that's probably close enough. If I had fresh material, I'd want to fill it up absolutely to the tippity top. Use a plastic lid because metal lids are going to get eaten by the vinegar. And then give that a good shake, because we want to mix that honey in and mix our herbs up and just really shake that up really well. Might take a while to get the honey to dissolve. I can still see some honey is stuck at the top there, so I'm going to keep on shaking. All right, there we go. Really nicely mixed. And I'm going to let this sit for probably a couple weeks and shake it periodically, and it'll be ready to go. You know, whenever it tastes good, I can strain it out, but usually I like to let this one sit, these Oxymels with the dried herbs, sit for about 2 weeks or so, and then I'll strain it out the way I strain out a lot of things, just, you know, a fine mesh metal strainer, and really push as much as I possibly can through there. And with this particular recipe, you may notice that there's some separation. You know, the vinegar itself does have some mother on the bottom that you might see. It's still going to continue fermenting in your active process because we're using live vinegar here. So you'll see a little sediment just from the vinegar, but also we are going to pull out some of the starches that are in these roots, and some of that sediment is just the roots. It's inulin and other various starches, and those are perfectly fine. They actually help feed your beneficial bacteria in your gut. So just shake it before you take it. But don't be alarmed if you see sediment. It's not it going bad. If it's going bad, you would actually notice that things are going when you open them, and they smell bad and they look bad, and you know, they taste off. Hopefully you figured out that it was bad before you tasted it. But you know, usually these Oxymels will keep for quite a while, and you can just keep this on your counter and take it by the spoonful, or this is pretty strong, so you could even just take a dropper full or two if you wanted to put it in a dropper bottle. You could leave this right out on your dinner table, so you take a squirt or two before you eat your meal, and it helps you digest your meal. And you can also use it to make all sorts of other recipes like salad dressings and cocktails and cordials and mocktails and so forth. So lots of flexibility here. I actually like Oxymels even more than I like your standard cordials, just for myself personally, to use them in recipes. But play around, create your own recipes, and happy herbal adventures.